Donald Trump says America is ready to destroy every Iranian bridge and power plant by midnight tomorrow if no deal is reached to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. 4 hours. That is how long he says it will take. No bridges, no power plants, Stone Age. Those were his exact words, spoken from the White House briefing room on camera in front of the global press corps on Easter Sunday. And I want you to sit with that phrase before we go anywhere else with this analysis, because Stone Age is not a military objective. Stone Age is not a targeting doctrine. Stone Age is not a term that appears in any legitimate rules of engagement document produced by any military that considers itself bound by the laws of armed conflict. Stone Age is a description of what happens to a civilian population when you deliberately destroy the infrastructure that keeps them alive. And deliberately destroying civilian infrastructure, bridges, power plants, water treatment facilities, the systems that a civilian population depends on for physical survival, is not a gray area in international humanitarian law. It is not a nuanced question that requires extensive legal briefing to resolve. It is a war crime. Article 54 of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions prohibits attacks on objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court lists intentionally directing attacks against civilian objects as a war crime. These are not obscure provisions that require specialist legal interpretation. They are the foundational architecture of the laws of armed conflict that the United States helped write, helped codify, and has spent decades invoking against adversaries who violated them. And the President of the United States just announced his intention to commit them in 4 hours if the terms of his negotiating position are not met by midnight tomorrow. Let me be precise about what I mean by announcement, because the word matters here. This was not a slip. This was not an off-script moment in which a fatigued president said something he did not mean. This was a deliberate public statement made in the White House press room on camera, with full awareness that it would be broadcast globally. The president was not describing a worst-case contingency that might occur under extreme circumstances. He was describing a scheduled operational plan with a stated timeline and a stated outcome. That is a public declaration of intent to commit acts that the United States has prosecuted other nations for committing. And the gap between what American law, American treaty obligations, and American military doctrine require of its armed forces and what the president just announced he intends to order them to do is a gap that no official statement, no press secretary clarification, and no retroactive legal memo can close. I want to address the military picture directly because the claim that 4 hours is sufficient to destroy most of Iran's infrastructure requires scrutiny that the briefing room environment did not provide and that the subsequent television coverage did not supply. Iran is a country of 85 million people spread across 1.6 million square kilometers of territory. Its electrical grid, its bridge network, its water treatment infrastructure are distributed across 31 provinces, across terrain that ranges from the Zagros mountain range to the Persian Gulf coast to the Caspian Sea littoral. The claim that 4 hours of American airstrikes can reduce this distributed national infrastructure to rubble rests on an operational assumption that I want to examine with the precision it deserves. American strike aircraft operating in Iranian airspace are doing so in an air defense environment that has already demonstrated, over the course of this conflict, capabilities that were not fully credited in pre-war assessments. The Bavar 373 sensor fusion architecture, the layered ballistic missile and drone inventory, the underground hardened facilities that complicate targeting even with the most current imagery intelligence. None of these constraints disappear because a deadline has been set. None of them accelerate their degradation because a president made a public statement in an Easter press conference. The aircraft that will fly those 4-hour missions are the same aircraft that have been flying over Iran for the past 5 weeks. The pilots are the same pilots. The munitions are the same munitions, drawn from the same depleted stockpiles, whose depletion rate has been a subject of internal Pentagon concern since before the first strike was executed. And the targets, the bridges, the power plants, the infrastructure nodes that a Stone Age outcome requires destroying are distributed across a target set whose size and geographic spread is inconsistent with a 4-hour timeline unless the operational tempo required to execute it exceeds what the current force posture in the theater can sustain. I am not saying the United States lacks the capability to inflict severe damage on Iranian civilian infrastructure. It does not lack that capability. What I'm saying is that the gap between the operational reality of what 4 hours of strikes can achieve and what the president described as the outcome of those strikes is a gap that will become visible the morning after the deadline expires if the strikes occur, and that visibility will carry its own set of consequences that nobody in the briefing room was asked to account for. Let me now address the deadline theater because this is the third or fourth time in 5 weeks that a deadline with an attached threat has been announced, allowed to expire, and then replaced with a new deadline with an attached threat. The pattern is now sufficiently established that it requires analytical treatment rather than simple documentation. When a military commander sets a deadline and the deadline passes without the threatened action, one of two things has occurred. Either the commander lacked the capability to execute the threat, or the commander decided the execution cost exceeded the benefit. Both of those explanations carry strategic implications that undermine the deterrent value of the next deadline. Adversaries are not naive. They watch patterns the same way any intelligence apparatus watches them, and they update their operational calculus based on what the pattern reveals about the actual versus stated intentions of the party making the threat. Iran has now watched multiple American deadlines come and go. Each extension has provided data. Each extension has informed the Iranian assessment of how seriously to treat the next deadline. The current 27-hour countdown is therefore not being processed in Tehran with the urgency that its public presentation implies. It is being processed through a filter of accumulated experience with this specific administration's pattern of deadline management. A deadline that is repeatedly extended is not a deadline. It is a negotiating tool deployed in public rather than across a table, and its public deployment serves a specific purpose that has nothing to do with the operational timeline of the military campaign. It signals domestic audiences that the president is in command and is exerting pressure. It signals Iranian negotiating counterparts that the military option remains on the table, and it signals the international community, specifically the European and Asian allies whose support has not materialized, that the conflict is approaching a resolution that their absence has not derailed. Each of those signals has a specific audience and a specific intended effect. What they do not constitute is a genuine operational warning that military action will occur at the stated time if stated conditions are not met, because the repeated extension of previous deadlines has already established that the stated conditions are negotiable and the stated timeline is adjustable. The Iranians understand this. Their negotiating posture is not being driven by the countdown clock that CNN was displaying below footage of the press conference. It is being driven by their own assessment of what they can extract from the negotiating process, given their current operational position, and given the economic trajectory of a conflict that has now closed the Strait of Hormuz for long enough to produce structural damage to global shipping infrastructure that no deadline can reverse. I want to address the rescue of the American airmen, because the president made it the emotional centerpiece of his Easter press conference, and the emotional framing around it served a specific narrative function that deserves examination. The rescue was real. An American pilot whose aircraft went down over Iranian territory was recovered. That is operationally significant, personally important to the service member and his family, and politically useful to an administration that has been managing a cascade of difficult military and economic news. What the president's framing of the rescue did not address was the operational context that produced the necessity for a rescue in the first place. An American aircraft went down over Iranian territory. The president described this as a dramatic rescue to be celebrated. The analytical question that the press room did not pursue is why an F-35 or whatever platform was involved was operating in a position that produced a shoot down over Iranian territory in the first place. The operational reality of that question is more consequential than the celebratory framing the rescue received. Aircraft do not go down over enemy territory in wars that are proceeding according to plan. They go down in wars where the air defense environment is more capable than the pre-war assessment credited, where the operational tempo is pushing sortie rates and crew fatigue beyond sustainable parameters, or where the mission profile required pilots to accept risk levels that the tactical situation demanded, but that the pre-war briefings did not anticipate. Which of those explanations accounts for this specific shoot-down, or what combination of them does, is information that is not available in the public record. But the gap between the celebratory press conference framing and the analytical reality of what an aircraft loss over enemy territory actually represents is a gap that a serious press corps would have pressed on, and that the television coverage has largely left unexplored. Now, let me address the stated negotiating position, because the president indicated that active negotiations are ongoing and that Iran has a willing participant on the other side. That is a different claim from previous statements about the status of talks, and it deserves careful parsing. A willing participant is not a committed partner. A willing participant is an interlocutor who has decided that the cost of remaining entirely outside a diplomatic channel exceeds the cost of maintaining contact with it. Iran maintaining contact with a negotiating channel while simultaneously continuing to fire missiles at Israel and maintaining the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is not a posture that looks like a government preparing to accept the terms the president described as his requirements for a deal. Those requirements include the reopening of international shipping lanes in the Strait. The Strait is still closed. Ships are still not transiting. Underwriters at Lloyd's are still not writing policies for Hormuz passage. The physical and commercial reality of the Strait's closure is not responding to the existence of a negotiating channel in the way that the president's public description of that channel implied it would. There is a specific dynamic in any negotiation where one side announces publicly that the other side is a willing participant, and that announcement serves the announcing side's domestic political interests more than it advances the negotiating objective. It allows the president to say simultaneously that diplomacy is working and that military pressure is responsible for that progress. Both claims serve domestic narrative purposes. Neither is verifiable in the terms the public audience is being asked to accept them. The Iranian side, for its part, has maintained the same public position throughout this conflict with a consistency that stands in striking contrast to the American communication pattern. Iran has not requested a ceasefire. Iran is not accepting ultimatums. Iran's foreign minister has stated these positions on American television. Iranian state media has broadcast them continuously. Iranian officials at every level of the government have said, with remarkable message discipline, that the terms of any arrangement will be Iran's terms, negotiated from Iran's current operational position, not terms dictated under threat of bombing by midnight. That posture is consistent with a government that believes its strategic position is stronger than the American deadline theater implies. And there are objective indicators in the operational record that support that belief. The Strait remains closed. The interceptor inventory on the Israeli and American side remains at levels described by United States officials as critically low. The factories producing replacement interceptors have been directly targeted and damaged. Allied nations have declined to commit forces or vessels. The economic damage is accumulating at a rate that affects American domestic political conditions in ways that the approaching midterm cycle makes increasingly consequential. Let me address the Israeli dimension of this conflict directly, because it is being systematically underweighted in the American coverage that focuses primarily on Trump's statements and American military operations. Israel is taking casualties. Real families in Haifa are being pulled from rubble. An elderly couple, their son and his wife, killed in a residential building by an Iranian missile that failed to intercept. These are not statistics. They are the operational reality of a war that was supposed to be short, decisive, and transformative, and that has instead entered its sixth week with the Iranian regime intact, the IRGC operationally functional, and Iranian missiles still reaching Israeli cities. The Israeli public's support for this war is weakening. Polls show it. The polling reflects something that the Israeli public understands from its own recent experience that the political leadership is not yet publicly acknowledging. Military campaigns that produce significant early success against an adversary's infrastructure do not necessarily produce the political outcome that the success was supposed to deliver. Gaza is still not resolved. Hezbollah rebuilt after 2006. The assumption that Iran would fracture under military pressure, the same assumption that has driven Israeli strategic thinking about every adversary in the region, has not been validated in 5 weeks of a campaign that has consumed more American and Israeli military resources than any comparable operation in the recent history of either country. The Israeli Prime Minister is listing military successes while Iranian missiles are still landing. Both things are true simultaneously, and the coexistence of those two truths is what the polling is measuring. You can destroy infrastructure, you can degrade capabilities, you can kill officers and disrupt supply chains and impose economic costs. None of those achievements, individually or in combination, translates automatically into the political outcome that the military campaign was designed to produce. The outcome requires the adversary to decide that the cost of continuing exceeds the cost of accepting the terms being offered. Iran has not made that decision. The evidence suggests Iran believes the reverse is true, and the objective indicators of the conflict's trajectory do not clearly contradict that belief. The war that the president described in the briefing room, a war that can be concluded in 4 hours if Iran fails to meet a midnight deadline, is not the war that is actually being fought. The war that is actually being fought is a war in which the United States has expended significant quantities of irreplaceable munitions, suffered aircraft losses, sustained base evacuations, watched 2 embassies close, absorbed over $1 billion in equipment losses, and presided over the largest disruption to global energy supply since the 1970s oil embargo, without producing the regime fracture that was the foundational assumption behind the decision to initiate hostilities. Those 2 wars, the one being described in press conferences and the one being fought in the operational record, are not the same war. The gap between them is not a matter of communication strategy or media framing. It is a matter of strategic assessment, and the assessment that produced the gap has consequences that no deadline, no threat, and no dramatic rescue can eliminate. What happens at midnight tomorrow, and the morning after that, and the week after that, will be determined by the operational reality of the conflict rather than by the public statements of an administration that has cycled through contradictory characterizations of the war's status, duration, and objectives with a frequency that has made those characterizations increasingly difficult to take as operational signals rather than political positioning. Stone Age was the word the president used. Let me tell you what Stone Age actually means as a military outcome, because the word has specific content that the press conference framing obscured. Destroying a nation's bridge network and power grid does not produce strategic submission in a population that has already demonstrated a willingness to absorb 5 weeks of American bombing. It produces suffering. It produces civilian deaths, civilian injuries, and civilian displacement at a scale that international law categorizes as prohibited under any circumstances. It produces the precise imagery and the precise civilian casualty toll that transforms whatever negotiating leverage the military campaign has generated into an international relations catastrophe from which no American diplomatic effort can easily recover. It produces conditions in which the Iranian population, which the president claimed in the same briefing room would welcome continued bombing as a path to freedom, consolidates behind its government rather than rising against it, because populations under sustained attack on their basic survival infrastructure do not primarily distinguish between the government that failed to prevent the attack and the government of the attacking country. They experience the attack. And what the people inside Iran that BBC Persian spoke with experienced is not what the president described. They expressed hatred. They expressed hopelessness. They expressed the specific despair of people who understand that ordinary people cannot stop what is being done to them by the most powerful military in the world. That testimony is not an operational variable in the 4-hour timeline, but it is the strategic reality that the 4-hour threat, if executed, will produce. And it is the reality that every government watching this conflict, every government that Washington needs as a partner in whatever comes after this conflict, is factoring into its assessment of American credibility, American reliability, and American fitness to lead the international order that it helped construct, and that it is now in the process of demonstrating it will abandon when abandoning it serves the immediate interests of the person currently holding the office of President of the United States.